his State of the Nation address to a joint sitting of the National Assembly and the Senate. In line with the law, the President will give a progress report of his government's key agenda. Last year, major focus was on the Big Four agenda, his main legacy project, the war on graft and uniting the country through the handshake and the BBI. These are still expected to largely feature in this year's speech, not forgetting the coronavirus pandemic and its after effects that remain a major headache for this government. On this episode of The Front Row, we look at the state of the nation before the real State of the Nation address. With a panel of experts, we take stock of where we are as a country and what the President must address on Thursday in line with the needs of the people. I am Akisa Wandera. Thank you for joining us. And to be part of this conversation, do log on to slido.com. Event code is #FrontRow. You can as well join us on Twitter at Akisa Wandera, at KTN News KE, the hashtag Tuesday's Front Row. Any question to our panelists, any contribution to this topic? I'll be sampling a number of your views as we go forward. Also remember, you can text us on 22155. Let's take a look at who we have for this episode of The Front Row, where we're talking about the state of the nation. Esther Okech is Executive Director and Programs Coordinator of the Kenya Female Advisory Organization. Okech is a member of various organizations, including the Kisumu chapter of the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry. She's also on the National Governing Council of the National Taxpayers Association, which looks at management and the utilization of devolved governance funds by the different members of parliament and how the restructuring of devolved governance at county government levels impact the community. Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Front Row, Esther. We also have Mr. Bill Okero, a former member of the Public Investments Committee of the National Assembly. He was Senator of Mandera County between the years 2013 and 2017, and as well as Mandera Central Member of Parliament from 2002 to 2007. He's previously also held positions of Managing Director, Audit Supervisor, and Member and Chair of various boards of directors. Thank you for joining us. And finally, Kwame Owino is an economist and the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs. He's been instrumental in leading the Institute of Economic Affairs, Kenya's strategic intervention into the go-to think tank for sub-Saharan Africa and the region. He's led research and policy dialogue in public expenditure and revenue analysis, international trade, economic regulation, devolution, and the use of future methodologies to inform public affairs in the country. Glad to have you on the panel for this episode of The Front Row. Before we get into it, let's start with some of the key things that President Uhuru Kenyatta talked about in last year's State of the Nation address in April, where he talked about how the economy has been growing and what was expected in this particular financial year. Then we can pick up the conversation from there.
Indeed, the Kenya shilling has held steady against major currencies, with an annual average exchange rate of about 101 to the US dollar. This was supported by a narrowing of the gap between our export of goods and services from 5.5% of gross domestic product in February of 2018 to 4.7% in February of 2019. Agricultural exports, particularly horticulture, receipts from tourism, and diaspora remittances largely explain the improvement in our current account position. In the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index 2019, Kenya's ranking improved 19 places to position 61 globally. This made our nation one of the most improved countries during the review period. It is our intention to build on this success to further improve our ranking to be among the top 20 by the year 2020, top 50 by the year 2020.
About the economic growth rather, and of course a lot of challenges have bedeviled this particular government. Key among them, the coronavirus pandemic that has seen a slouch in economic growth in the country in general, GDP. I'd like to start with you, Kwame. We know you have been analyzing the economy, looking very keenly and critically at some of the key indicators of this all. Where are we now from when the president gave this speech? Sounding very optimistic about the economy, looking at the issues we've gone through as a country. Where would we say we are as a country?
Okay, thanks. I think if you think about it 1 year before, of course, it's a little later than a year. But if you think about it last year, beginning of this year, of course, there's the expectation that the momentum would continue, even if the backside was concern about public debt and obviously private sector activity had reduced in some sectors. But right now, obviously, we're in the phase of recovery because of that convergence between the COVID-19 emergency and at the same time, a softening economy, which started sometime in February and March. So there's been recovery, but as we all know, again, there's reason to be concerned because infections are going up, job losses have not fully recovered, government spending is below, government revenues are below the expected targets, and obviously government has expanded the deficit. So if you put everything all together from the jobs, from the employment, manufacturing, and many sectors such as agriculture, we're just in a recovery phase, and I hope that there's no second shock, especially because the late rains, or rather the short rains expected between October and the end of December are actually being delayed in some parts of the country. So that might affect food prices and food output. So it's a far more risky picture today than it was when the president read presented the State of the Union last year.
Mr. Bilokero, from where we were last year in April when the president was giving this particular address, we are now in November, just a month or so shy of the end of the year. How do things look like from where you sit?
Well, I think a lot of water has gone under the bridge since then, not just in Kenya, but globally. And we are not in an island. I think what has happened, particularly the coronavirus pandemic, has had dramatic, impact, adverse impact on the economies globally, and this has had a serious impact on Kenya, particularly the exports that the president was talking about. We are key exporters of horticulture, coffee, tea, and and tourism. All these are sectors that have been adversely affected, even as we speak. But I think, so in my view, we have an economy, much as the government would say otherwise, which many of us is in recession. An economy is in recession when you see the performance of the companies, even those blue chip companies on the stock exchange. The massive losses that have been reported by many companies, the job cuts and the job losses, and generally you find the low level of demand, aggregate demand. This is what the private sector is saying, that demand is very low because of many people have lost their incomes. So I think the situation it's far worse than it was, and obviously because of the external shocks like the coronavirus.
Talking about recovery phase, as Kwame has rightly put it, we're now seemingly just recovering. What would be the key indicators for us to say we are getting there? Bilokero. All right, we seem to have a problem with that connection, so I think I'll throw this question back to you, Kwame, before I go to Esther. We're telling Kenyans now that perhaps we are on a recovery path. The government injected billions of shillings in terms of stimulus packages into various bits of this economy. So when do we say things are looking up for us?
Okay, I think we'll say when things are looking up for us when you look at the data for the third quarter of the year, which is the quarter that started in end of July. August and September, because that's the first quarter when obviously the restrictions have been brought down. The first quarter, the quarter before it saw the job losses, the massive restrictions on movement, schools were closed, and a lot of things have happened. Now, when there's ease of those restrictions happened sometime in middle of July, obviously companies started to reopen, global markets, global supply chains for manufacturing sector opened up as well. The rains have not been very, very bad, and obviously the effect of the locusts were not as bad as was expected, though of course it's continuing. But so one of the things we look at, the first thing we look at is just basically the quarterly growth, because if you know that growth in the quarter from March to June was actually negative 5.7, unprecedented in the last 20 years. So one of the things we look at is whether growth has taken place. The second is whether jobs are recovering. It's very unlikely that 1.7 million jobs will have been created in a quarter, especially if that's what the economy creates in 2 years on a good stretch. So looking at growth rates, looking at employment rates, obviously on the banking side, looking at how much lending goes forth, and government's revenues as well, to see whether many more companies are recovering and are able to pay their taxes. Right. So if you look at all those four things, you'll be able to give us a good grasp, a good picture about how far we've gone from the darkest point in mid-June.
Let's bring in Esther to this conversation. Looking at where we are, and I'd really like to hear your analysis of this all, but you're also in the governing council of the National Taxpayers Association. Our tax regime has been grandly affected by this coronavirus pandemic. How do things look like from your side?
One of the things that we look at is that the coronavirus has affected at the lower levels a lot more. The businesses at the lower levels have been affected. And whilst we look at how the tax regime is responding to the issues of the lower consumers and the lower income traders, we feel that nothing has truly been done to support the low income traders, because even when you're looking at the response to the economic, the recovery packages, one of the things that it was mega, horticulture at a mega level. But when looking at subsistence, people at community level, nothing has been done. When we speak at horticulture, but we never speak about even the lower level of women who do aquaculture, the women who do fishing and trade, but they all pay tax. So part of it is that when we look at the response, those industries at all levels were hit. But the fact is that we are only looking at a higher level. So how come when we look at this is that the response has not been holistically towards persons within the lower communities, persons who are evicted from the spaces where they exist, for example, in the markets, who has responded to the people who were removed from the markets who used to do trade at that particular level because of COVID. So even in terms of reallocation of spaces and ensuring that they can go back to doing trade, we have a lot of challenges.
So looking at some of the interventions really from the government, waiving of tax for low-income earners, cutting it down by 25 to 25% for the rest of the group. Would you say this has meant much for the common Kenyan?
The tax has gone down, but the costs of expenses have gone higher. So part of the whole question is that whilst we are talking about a wider tax relief, how many people fit within the tax relief if other things do not go down? So you look at the wider band. Has VAT gone down, the cost of goods, those kind of things? Do we get tax relief within those kind of places? Or even when you're talking about relief to even the different persons living with different disabilities, how are they being mapped so that then they're able to get tax reliefs within that particular spaces where they exist? Because even at this particular level, they're still supposed to be assessed. So even when you're talking about the tax reliefs which are supposed to be received, there needs to be a better assessment so that then we are looking at the reach of that tax band and the revenue collectors to those particular people who were deeply affected at the lower units, who lost their jobs. So part of it is that when you're looking at the response, who is responding to the job cuts and the job losses in the industries like small eateries where people no longer go to eat because people don't have work. So those are the kind of places where we are looking at. Look at the lower tax payers who are not at the mega level where they're seen. So these lower tax people who pay tax are, in my opinion, forgotten.
So then is this something you expect the president to address on Thursday during the State of the Nation address?
Yes, it is important to address those issues because this is where, for us, who also work with women in trade, who work at the lower income, in the markets and in those spaces where then they're not able to trade as effectively as before, it is important for the president to actually address these issues of ensuring that we are able to then participate more holistically as small taxpayers, not only as the larger taxpayers who then got a wider benefit, and then expand also the different industries and even the cottage industries who have been affected. Because, for example, when we look at the industries like the aquaculture sector, for example, who have been affected by the closure of borders, and some of the materials which they use like nets come from overseas. So it means that, particularly China, it means that when they're importing all these products, the cost has gone higher. So it means the cost of doing business has become more expensive for that type of business person. So we would like these people to engage at that level so that we say that the smaller taxpayers must also be included in that conversation of rebates.
Of concern as well, and one of the key things that the president is expected to address is give a progress report of the Big Four agenda. We're talking universal healthcare, we're talking manufacturing, food security, as well as affordable housing. The coronavirus pandemic, as we all know it, has brought about a lot of disruptions. Perhaps some of these projects were stagnated. So then, how do you look at this, Kwame, looking at the Big Four and the targets that this government had given itself, the amount of money that has gone into the Big Four agenda? Just this year, almost 450 billion, I'll confirm that shortly, went into the Big Four, key pillars of the Big Four agenda. Looking at the disruptions this year and how money has been spread around, is this project still realistic? Is it achievable from where you sit, Kwame?
Yes, I think, I think the president is determined, or rather, let me say the Jubilee administration is determined to take forward the Big Four agenda. Of course, they would have to be very much more modest, especially because the revenues will not come through. And because the revenues, as anticipated, will not come through, one of the typical responses is to expand the debt. And as we've seen, there's already a supplementary budget to expand the debt. Part of it is justified in terms of the shock from from the crisis of COVID-19 crisis. But on the whole, it's clear that government is interested in the big capital projects. And you saw some of them being launched today. All those, the expressway and a few other things that the president is going to have to, is committed to completing, tells us that, yes, the housing projects, I think, will be more modest, but on the whole, they'll be spending and piecing of money here and there. So we don't expect it to go full throttle, but at the same time, obviously, the administration is determined to maintain the momentum for the constructions, whether it's the roads that are supposed to be constructed. Obviously, you see the expressway. There are other projects that are obviously happening across county roads. All those are happening in addition to other construction that government had anticipated. So it's, I think it's a wait. It's going slow to actually wait for the season to pass. But on the whole, some of the money that had been committed is still being spent anyway.
Bilakara, for you, the Big Four agenda, looking at how money is being spread around, and especially for these key pillars, the president still seemingly very upbeat. Kwame is pretty positive that perhaps we need to be modest, but we are on the right track. Is it the same for you? Do you share the same sentiments?
I'm not as optimistic as Kwame. I think from the start, the government has bitten far more than it can chew. I mean, to be frank, you are looking at food security. what progress is going on in terms of food security, really. You look at universal health care. I don't need to say much. I mean, everyone knows what's going on, and there isn't much in terms of the, any significant improvement. Of course, there are some programs that have been launched here and there, but the reality is you've seen patients complain that even where they have launched those programs, they're still being asked to pay, and the services are still not significantly improved. The housing also, of course. But I think despite of the government seems to have clearly, I've lost focus on the big four, and this has been repeatedly raised. I think that the government is now has been more focused on the issues of the BBIs and of referendums, and I think as usual, our priorities have become misplaced along the way. And of course, then the growing pandemic has also Kwame says, taken away most of the attention and also the resources. But I think for me the bigger issue is there isn't a significant expectation really on Big Four because of the challenges in terms of revenue. And the government has borrowed so much that today, I was just looking at central bank reports that, they've overdrawn by over 63 billion, one of the highest in the last few years. So I think there are challenges. I don't think that the Big Four has really given way to the big one, which is about the BBI or whatever it's worth.
All right, and remember, you can be part of this conversation. Currently, we're talking about the Big Four agenda. How has this government performed from where you sit? We'd really love to hear your thoughts on this. Text us on 22155, tweet us at Kisa Wandera, at KTN News KE. Hashtag to use is a front row. You can as well log on to slido.com. The hashtag to use is a front row. When we get back, Esther will be giving us her thoughts on the Big Four agenda. How impactful are they? How achievable are they with the president having less than 2 years to leave office? What are we looking at? Does it impact the common Kenyan down on the ground? We'd love you to chime into this conversation as well. Let's take a quick break. When we get back, the Big Four agenda, public spending, public debt, and of course the war on graft. And what are your expectations for President Uhuru Kenyatta's State of the Nation address? We'll be back with that and more.